My sister looked at me across a white tablecloth table at a restaurant on King West, and told me, with a smile she'd clearly been practicing, that I simply wasn't the right fit for her wedding. My mother squeezed my hand and whispered that I should just be gracious about it. So I was gracious. I went home. I said nothing. 4 days later, her future in-laws posted a video to their Facebook page that went quietly viral in the worst way. Footage of my sister's fiancé having 3 consecutive credit cards declined at their own engagement dinner, while 60 guests watched in absolute silence. I was sitting at my kitchen island with a mug of dark roast, reading the comments rolling in. I smiled into my coffee. I knew exactly what had happened. I knew exactly why it had happened, and I had known for months. Before I tell you the rest, let me say this. My name is Celeste. I am 31 years old. I live in a condo in Toronto's East End that most people assume I rent. I have been quietly building something for the past 7 years that my family knows nothing about, and everything that happened at my sister's wedding, every spectacular, public, unrecoverable moment of it, was the direct result of a lie they told themselves for so long they forgot it wasn't true. My family grew up in Mississauga, not the part of Mississauga people brag about, but a perfectly fine subdivision off Erin Mills Parkway, where every house looks like the one beside it, and the big excitement is when the neighbor finally replaces their front door. My father built a decent life running a plumbing supply business. My mother spent the better part of 20 years trying to pretend they'd built something more than that. She had a gift for social climbing that was genuinely impressive if you didn't have to live with it. She kept a list. I am not making this up. An actual handwritten list of which neighbors had pools, which ones drove European cars, and which ones had kids at private schools. We were never on the interesting side of that list, and I think that shaped everything that came after. My sister is 4 years younger than me. She is beautiful in the way that makes rooms go a little quiet when she walks in, and she learned early that this was something she could use. My parents celebrated every small thing she did as though it were a miracle. She got into Western for business administration and they threw a party. I got a full scholarship to Waterloo for software engineering, and my mother said, "Oh, that's wonderful, sweetheart, but do you think you'll meet anyone there?" "Engineers can be so," she trailed off. She never finished that sentence. She didn't need to. After university, I took a job at a tech firm in Kitchener, saved aggressively, and started quietly investing in distressed real estate on the side. Nothing dramatic at first, a small condo in Hamilton that I renovated and rented out, a duplex in Brantford. But I had a good eye for undervalued assets, and a better eye for the moment a property was in enough trouble that the lender would consider a creative exit. By the time I was 27, I had incorporated a numbered company, 2847631 Ontario Limited. Nothing glamorous about that name, and started acquiring mortgage positions from lenders who were tired of managing problem files. I wasn't foreclosing on people. I was buying the debt, offering the original owners structured workouts, and in some cases letting them stay on as tenants while things stabilized. It was less dramatic than it sounds. It was also extraordinarily profitable. My family thought I was a freelance software consultant who worked from home in yoga pants and probably maxed out a line of credit to afford my condo. I had let them think this because every time I tried to explain what I actually did, my mother's eyes glazed over after the first sentence, and my father changed the subject to whether I was dating anyone. They weren't interested in understanding it, so I stopped explaining, and they stopped asking, and we arrived at a comfortable mutual fiction where I was the quiet, ordinary sister who had peaked at Waterloo and was now just getting by. My sister, meanwhile, had moved to Vancouver after graduation, launched 3 separate wellness brand businesses that each lasted roughly 8 months, and eventually met a man at a charity event who was introduced to her as coming from old money in Victoria. His father apparently had commercial real estate holdings throughout BC. My sister called my mother with the news, and my mother called me immediately, and I could hear in her voice that she had already started rewriting the family story in her head. The engagement dinner in Toronto was my mother's idea. She wanted to celebrate properly, with the right restaurant, the right wine, the right impression. She booked a private dining room at a place on King West where the tasting menu is $400 before tax and tip. I showed up in dark jeans and a clean gray blazer because I genuinely own almost nothing that counts as occasion wear by my mother's standards. My sister was already at the table when I arrived, wearing something silk and backless, and the look she gave my outfit was so fast and so complete that I almost admired its efficiency. Dinner was fine for about an hour. My sister's fiancé talked about his family's portfolio in a way that made it clear he expected everyone to be impressed, and my parents obliged enthusiastically. I listened and ate. Around the time they brought out the second course, I noticed my sister reaching into her bag and pulling out a cream-colored envelope. She slid it across the table to me the way you slide something to someone you want to make a point to. Not handed, slid. I opened it. It was not a wedding invitation. It was a typed letter on heavy cardstock, explaining, in very considered language, that my sister and her fiancé had given a great deal of thought to the guest list for both the engagement events and the wedding itself, and that given the nature of the occasion, a blending of two families with a certain kind of profile, they felt it would be better for everyone if I sat this one out. The word they used was optics. She was worried about the optics of having a sibling whose lifestyle didn't align with the tone they were setting for the celebration. She suggested I take some time for myself that weekend and she would share photos after. I read the letter twice. I set it down. I looked at my mother, who was looking at her water glass. I looked at my father, who appeared to be deeply interested in the breadbasket. My sister leaned forward slightly. "It's not personal, Celeste," she said, quietly enough that the adjacent tables couldn't hear clearly but loudly enough that they could if they tried. "You know how these things work. We're trying to create a certain experience for his family, and, look, you're great, but you show up to everything in the same blazer, you drive a 12-year-old Civic, you talk about software instead of asking about people. His mother is going to be there, his father's business partners. I just need everything to look right." My mother reached over and patted my forearm. "Let her have this one," she murmured. "She's been planning this for so long." I sat very still. This is something I learned over many years of being the quiet sister in a loud family. Stillness makes people uncomfortable. They can't read it. They don't know whether you're about to cry or about to do something else entirely. I picked up the envelope. I set it beside my plate. I finished my dinner. When the bill came, my mother started fishing in her bag for her visa. I held up my hand and told the server I'd take it. I put my card on the table. It is a matte black corporate card issued by the private banking division at RBC, the kind that most people in that restaurant would recognize immediately. My sister looked at it, then looked at me. "You don't have to do that," she said, and her voice had shifted slightly. "And Snock's got gratitude, just recalibration." "It's fine," I said. The transaction processed in less than 2 seconds. I added 25% because the server had been excellent, and the situation at our table had clearly been making his evening difficult. I thanked everyone, wished my sister congratulations, and walked out. My car was parked 3 blocks away. It is not a 12-year-old Civic. It is a 4-year-old Civic, which I drive because it is reliable, and parking in the East End of Toronto is already a headache without worrying about door dings on something expensive. I drove home. I poured myself a glass of wine I'd been saving. I sat on my balcony and thought about the letter, thought about my sister's fiancé, and thought about the thing I had known for a few months that I had not yet decided what to do with. Then I called my accountant. She handles the most sensitive parts of my portfolio, including a property file I'd acquired the summer before last. 2 years ago, my parents had quietly and without telling anyone fallen behind on the mortgage for the cottage. Not the Mississauga house, the cottage. The Muskoka cottage on a lake 40 minutes north of Huntsville, that my grandfather had built, and my father had inherited, and my mother treated as the centerpiece of their entire social identity. They had been carrying it for years on cash flow that no longer supported it. The lender had begun the process of enforcing the mortgage. A colleague had flagged the file to me in the ordinary course of business. I looked at it, recognized the address, and, this is the part that still surprises me when I think about it, I bought the mortgage. Not to punish them, not to arrange some elaborate scheme. I bought it because my firm specialized in exactly this kind of workout. And because the alternative was a public power of sale that would have destroyed them socially in a way they would never have recovered from. I offered them a confidential restructuring through outside counsel, transfer title by deed in lieu, clear the deficiency, stay in the cottage under a subsidized lease with a right to repurchase if they could cure the arrears within 3 years. My father signed the papers. I do not know what he told my mother. He certainly never told my sister. To the best of my knowledge, they all believed they had simply refinanced with a private lender, and that the cottage was still fully theirs. What my father did not know, what none of them knew, was that the numbered company he'd signed those papers to was mine. They had been making lease payments to me for 2 years. They called them mortgage payments. They weren't. The cottage was mine. And when my father mentioned at that dinner table that he was planning to remortgage it to cover wedding costs, which I overheard while putting on my coat, I knew immediately that no bank would give him a cent. Any lender who ran a title search would see the transfer on record at the land registry office. He wasn't the registered owner. There was nothing to borrow against. But he didn't know that. He was walking toward a wall he couldn't see yet. What he also didn't know, what I had been piecing together for weeks, was that my sister's fiancé was in considerably worse shape than anyone understood. His family's commercial real estate holdings in Victoria did not appear to exist in any form I could verify. The father had 2 numbered companies on record, both dissolved. A yacht my future brother-in-law had appeared beside in Instagram photos belonged to a charter company in Nanaimo. The office address listed on his LinkedIn led to a shared workspace that rented desks by the hour. I'd asked my accountant to keep pulling the thread. She called me, the morning after the dinner. Her voice was the careful kind of flat that experienced professionals use when they have something alarming to share. My sister's fiancé had been a signatory on a numbered corporation in BC that had received 2 large wire transfers in the past year from a shell company currently under review by the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada. The transfers had been reversed. The vendors who'd received deposits from that account, a florist, a catering company, a photographer, had been sending formal demand letters for 60 days. My sister was planning a wedding that was being paid for with money that had already bounced. I told my accountant to document everything and I went for a long walk along the waterfront. I thought about calling my sister. I thought about calling my mother. I decided not to. The shape of the situation was still forming and I didn't want to tip anyone off before I understood it completely. I also, I'll be honest about this, had just been uninvited from a family celebration because of my blazer. I was not feeling especially generous. 3 days later, the video appeared. My sister's future mother-in-law had posted it herself, apparently not realizing how widely it would travel. 60 guests at a private dining room in Yaletown, Vancouver. The engagement dinner on the West Coast that I hadn't been invited to either. My sister's fiancé's card declined. Then a second card. Then his father quietly excusing himself to make a call that apparently resolved nothing. The mother-in-law's face in the background, doing the math in real time. The comment section was gentle by internet standards but unmistakably clear. Something had gone badly wrong with the groom's finances, and 60 people who'd driven to Yaletown in their best coats all knew it. I read the comments, I finished my coffee, I texted my accountant, pull everything, I want the full picture before the wedding. The wedding was scheduled 6 weeks out, at an estate winery near Niagara-on-the-Lake, the kind of venue that appears in bridal magazines, with a stone manor house and rows of grapevines and a terrace overlooking the lake on a clear day. My sister had been posting about it for 8 months. What she did not know, and what I hadn't thought about until I checked my portfolio files 2 days after the video surfaced, was that the winery was one of 7 properties I'd acquired through a struggling Ontario hospitality group 2 years prior. The previous owners had overextended on renovations, right before a difficult stretch in the wine country market. I'd purchased the group's distressed assets as part of a larger transaction, and quietly became the majority investor in the operating trust. My name appeared nowhere visible. The estate ran under its original name and management. My sister had booked her wedding at my winery. I want to be precise about what I decided to do with that information. I did not decide to ruin her wedding. I decided to visit my property. I was the majority owner of a luxury estate and I had not been there since the acquisition. The visit was overdue. The fact that a wedding was occurring the same weekend was, practically speaking, irrelevant to me. The owner's suite on the upper floor of the manor was a private residence. Completely separate from the event spaces, accessible only by a restricted service lift that wedding guests had no knowledge of. My presence would not affect anyone's celebration. I drove down on the Thursday. The valley in June is extraordinary. The vines in their early summer green, the light off the lake, the air that smells like warm earth and something almost sweet. I had a very good dinner on my private terrace, read for 2 hours, slept 8 hours, and woke up Friday morning feeling more settled than I had in months. My phone rang at 10:15. It was a number I didn't recognize. It was my future brother-in-law. His voice had the carefully calibrated ease of someone who has practiced being charming and is still practicing. He apologized for bothering me. He said he'd been thinking about how unfair the situation in Toronto had been, and that frankly my sister had been out of line, and that he'd always thought I seemed like the more grounded of the two, the one worth actually knowing. I listened without saying much, which seemed to unsettle him slightly. He pivoted. He said he was in a temporary cash flow situation, just a timing issue with a transfer from his family's holding company. And he was wondering whether I might be in a position to help with a short-term bridge loan. $40,000. He could have it back within 2 weeks once his accounts cleared. $40,000. From the sister who'd been uninvited for her blazer. I walked to the edge of my terrace. I looked at the vineyard below, the same vineyard where in 36 hours my sister was going to walk down an aisle between rented chairs in a dress that cost more than most people's used cars. I said, "Tell me more about the situation." He told me more than he meant to. Once he started, he couldn't quite stop, the way people can't when they've carried something alone too long and suddenly believe they've found a safe place to set it down. He admitted that the family trust was essentially empty, that his father's business had gone into creditor protection the previous year, that the deposits on the wedding vendors had been sent from an account now under FinTrack review, and the funds had been reversed, that the vendors were expecting certified checks the morning of the wedding and he did not have them, that he had borrowed money from a private individual, not a financial institution, a private individual, to cover the engagement ring and the BC events, and that individual was not the kind of person who accepted apologies in lieu of payment. And then he said the thing that completed the picture entirely. He said he was going through with the wedding, because my parents had indicated the Muskoka cottage would be signed over to my sister as a wedding gift, that the property was worth, conservatively, $2.3 million on the current market, that once they were married, he intended to help my sister list it immediately and use the proceeds to clear his debts and start over. He was marrying my sister to liquidate an asset she didn't own, on a property my parents couldn't legally transfer, at a venue that was mine. I let a few seconds of silence settle between us. Then I said, "That's a really difficult situation. Let me see what I can do. Can we talk in person tomorrow morning?" He said of course. He sounded genuinely relieved. He thanked me 3 times and said he knew I was the reasonable one. I hung up, opened my laptop and forwarded a summary of the conversation to my accountant and my solicitor. The terrace security system had recorded everything in clear audio as it was designed to. I slept very well that night. The wedding day arrived sunny and warm, the kind of June morning that makes everyone at a vineyard estate look like they belong in a magazine. I was on my terrace with an Americano when I watched, through my tablet security feed, my family arrive at the front entrance below. My sister was already issuing instructions to the event coordinator before the car had fully stopped. My mother was looking around with the bright, slightly desperate happiness of someone who has staked a very great deal on a single afternoon. The first problem surfaced before noon. The head caterer came to find my father at 11:40. I watched the exchange on the security feed. The certified check that had been provided for the catering balance, $12,000, had been returned by the issuing institution the previous day. The caterer needed cleared payment before service could begin. My father smiled the smile of a man buying time he doesn't have. He put a card into the portable terminal. It processed declined. He tried a second card. My mother appeared at his elbow. 3 more cards between them, each one declined. My father's face moved through several stages I had never seen on him before. My future brother-in-law was summoned. I watched him try his own card. I already knew what would happen. He stood very still after the decline, looking at the terminal the way you look at something when you are deciding whether losing your temper will help anything. It would not. He knew it. The caterer radioed his team. Quietly, professionally, the service staff began moving equipment back toward the kitchen. The open bar that had been arranged on the stone terrace was disassembled with practiced efficiency. The guests who had already arrived on the grounds watched this happen, with the frozen attention of people who cannot look away from something they don't fully understand yet. I changed into a cream linen blazer, still a blazer, I make no apologies, and took the service lift down. I had asked the estate manager to bring my family to the private meeting room off the main corridor when the situation became unmanageable. He had done so. I walked down the hall and pushed open the door. My mother was holding a damp cocktail napkin she'd been pressing to her face. My father was standing with his arms crossed, using the posture of authority to cover the fact that he had none left. My sister was still in her dress, her veil askew, her expression the particular fury of someone who has never once encountered the word no from the physical universe and is meeting it for the first time at full speed. My future brother-in-law stood slightly apart from the three of them, which told me he had already grasped at some level exactly how this was going to end. I walked to the chair behind the manager's desk and sat down. The room went completely still. "What are you doing here?" my father said. His voice was flat with something that wasn't quite anger, more like the first stage of a realization he was refusing to finish. I folded my hands on the desk and looked at each of them in turn. "I own this property," I said. My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before. My sister's mouth opened. My father shook his head slowly, as though the physical act of disagreement might change the words. "You're a software consultant," my father said. "You work from home." I did for a while, 7 years ago. Since then, I've built a real estate investment firm. This winery is one of several properties in my portfolio. I acquired it 2 years ago through a holding company. I paused. The same holding company that holds the mortgage on the cottage. That landed differently than I expected. My father's face didn't show shock, it showed recognition. The kind that surfaces when you've suspected something you've never allowed yourself to examine, and someone finally says the quiet part aloud. "The private lender," he said. "Yes." My mother turned to look at him. Whatever he had told her about the refinancing 2 years ago, it had not included the possibility that the private lender was their daughter. I placed a copy of the registered title on the desk. My sister moved closer to read it. I watched her work through the name of the numbered company. I watched her work through what it meant. "The cottage was never going to be given to you," I said, looking at her directly. "Dad doesn't have the authority to transfer it. He signed it to my company 2 years ago to avoid a power of sale. I've let the family use it because I chose to, but it was never in your name and it was never going to be." My sister looked at her fiancé. Something passed between them, not love, not even real anger, but the specific look of two people realizing simultaneously that the plan they each had for the other person has just collapsed. He started to say something. I picked up my tablet and turned it to face the room. I pressed play. His own voice came out of the speaker. Clear, calm, completely recognizable. "I'm only going through with the wedding because your parents said the cottage would be signed over to your sister. Worth at least $2.3 million on the current market. Once we're married, I want to list it immediately and clear my debts." The sound of my sister's name in his own explanation of why he was marrying her. She stood completely still while the recording played. When it finished, she turned to face him. He held up both hands and started to explain that it wasn't what it sounded like, that he'd been under enormous pressure, that he loved her, that she had to understand. She picked up the small vase of hydrangeas from the corner of the meeting table, white ones, very June, very Niagara, and threw them at him, not at his head, at his chest. The ceramic hit the floor and shattered. Water spread across the tile in a wide, quiet arc. Nobody moved for a moment. I looked at the estate manager, who was standing in the doorway. "Please contact the police regarding the fraudulent vendor deposits and arrange for security to escort this guest off the property," I said. I opened a second document and placed it on the desk in front of my father. "These are the title papers the cottage file has been waiting for. Once they're signed and witnessed, we can discuss the repurchase timeline if you want to pursue that option. You have 30 days to vacate the property under the lease terms." My solicitor can work with you on the details. My father sat down in a chair. He looked at the document, he looked at me. He looked older than I had ever seen him look, and I understood in that moment that this was not something I had done to him. This was something that had already been true, and I had simply stopped pretending otherwise. My mother sat beside him. She did not reach over to pat my arm this time. The police arrived within 20 minutes. My future brother-in-law walked out with them, without being asked twice, which I thought showed a certain situational clarity he should have applied much earlier. The guests outside had mostly understood by then that the afternoon was not proceeding as planned. Some had already driven back toward the highway. A few stood by the vineyard fence, looking out at the lake, still holding the programs they'd been handed at the entrance, and not quite sure what to do with them now. I went back upstairs. I poured a glass of the estate's own Chardonnay, genuinely excellent, from the harvest before I acquired the property, and I stood on the terrace in my linen blazer and watched the afternoon light move slowly across the vines below. I have thought about whether to call what happened that weekend justice, or revenge, or simply consequence. I keep coming back to consequence, because I didn't build any of this to arrive at that afternoon. I didn't arrange for the cottage to fall into arrears. I didn't plant my sister's fiancé, didn't engineer the bounce deposits, didn't choose the venue. I built a business. I made decisions, and those decisions happened to sit, quietly, at the very center of every assumption my family had built their plans around. They mistook my silence for emptiness. They looked at my blazer, my old Civic, my unremarkable condo, and they decided there was nothing underneath worth their attention. They uninvited me from a family celebration because of the optics, and then they built their entire future on a foundation that turned out to belong to me. My mother called 3 weeks later. She didn't apologize exactly, that's not how she operates, but she asked how I was, and when I said I was well, she paused long enough that I understood she was looking for a way back in that didn't require her to say the things she needed to say out loud. I told her the 30-day notice on the cottage stood, but that I'd have my solicitor reach out about the repurchase option if my father was interested. She said she'd talk to him. My sister has not been in touch. I haven't reached out to her either. I think we both understand clearly now where things stand and what the distance between us actually is. I still drive the same Civic, I still wear the same blazer. I still start every morning with a dark roast from the same mug that says nothing interesting on the side. The winery had its best revenue quarter since I acquired it. The Chardonnay won a regional award in the fall. I'm planning to visit again during harvest. September, when the valley smells like something earned. I'll stay in the same suite, I'll bring a better bottle. Some things, it turns out, are worth the wait.